Throughout human history, across every culture and civilization, we find a peculiar and persistent pattern, the belief in a malevolent external force that threatens our spiritual well-being. We've called it by many names: Satan, Iblis, Mara, the devil, the adversary, the tempter. Religious traditions have devoted immense energy to describing this entity, depicting its features, cataloging its tactics, and developing elaborate rituals to ward off its influence. From exorcism ceremonies to prayer shields, from protective amulets to spiritual warfare manuals, humanity has built an extensive infrastructure around battling this supposedly external threat. Yet something strange happens when we look closely at these depictions across different times and places. The devil mysteriously shifts form to embody precisely what each culture fears most. In agricultural societies, it appears as the bringer of drought or pestilence. In hierarchical civilizations, it becomes the force of chaos and disorder. In sexually restrictive cultures, it manifests as the seducer. In individualistic modern societies, it emerges as the force that threatens personal autonomy. This chameleon-like quality raises a disturbing question. What if this supposedly external enemy is actually something else entirely? What if the devil isn't out there, but is instead a projection of something within ourselves that we're too frightened to acknowledge? This isn't merely an academic question, but one with profound implications for spiritual development and psychological well-being. Consider the pattern that repeats throughout religious history. The more vigorously a person or culture attempts to battle the external devil, the more powerfully it seems to manifest in their experience. Medieval Europe, with its intense focus on Satan, paradoxically experienced unprecedented outbreaks of supposed demonic activity. Modern fundamentalist communities that emphasize spiritual warfare often report the highest levels of perceived demonic oppression. It's as if the very act of pushing away this enemy actually strengthens its presence in our lives. A 19th century philosopher, working in isolation and often vilified by religious authorities, developed a revolutionary insight that might explain this paradox. His analysis suggested that what we call the devil isn't an external entity, but a projection of disowned aspects of ourselves, the shadow parts of our psyche that we're too frightened to acknowledge as our own. This perspective doesn't deny the reality of evil or negative forces, but reconceptualizes their location and nature in a way that opens up entirely new possibilities for spiritual transformation. What if the devil you've been taught to fear and fight isn't your enemy at all, but a distorted projection of parts of yourself that you've been conditioned to reject? What if the battle isn't meant to be waged externally, but requires a radical inner recognition and integration? And what if religions have been encoding this psychological truth in symbolic language all along, waiting for us to decipher its deeper meaning? The implications would transform not just our understanding of evil, but our entire approach to spiritual development. I invite you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about the nature of spiritual opposition, because the answer might not be what you've been taught. What if the path to liberation isn't found in endless battle against an external adversary, but in the courageous integration of the very aspects of yourself that you've been taught to fear? Let's examine a curious phenomenon that appears throughout religious and spiritual traditions, a pattern so consistent yet so overlooked that it suggests something fundamental about the nature of what we call the devil. When spiritual teachers and religious figures reach advanced states of development, their relationship with evil undergoes a dramatic transformation. Rather than perceiving the devil as an external entity to be battled, they begin describing it in increasingly psychological and internal terms. Consider Jesus in the wilderness. The Gospel accounts describe Satan appearing to him as an external entity offering temptations. Yet Jesus doesn't engage in elaborate spiritual warfare tactics. He simply refuses to be moved from his center, suggesting a recognition that the real battle is internal. Buddha's encounter with Mara follows a similar pattern. Initially depicted as an external demon sending armies and temptations, Mara eventually becomes, in more advanced Buddhist teachings, a representation of internal delusion rather than an external force. This pattern repeats across traditions. Advanced mystics consistently move from literal to psychological interpretations of evil. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "The enemy is your own perception," directly suggesting that Satan isn't an external being, but a manifestation of internal division. Christian mystic Teresa of Avila noted in her later writings that what most people call demonic attacks are actually encounters with disowned aspects of themselves. Jewish mystical tradition contains teachings that the Satan, Ha-Satan, is actually a projection of human fears and desires rather than an independent entity. These advanced interpretations stand in stark contrast to the popular understanding of evil as an external force to be combated. Another anomaly appears when we examine how representations of the devil evolve over time. Early Christian depictions showed Satan as remarkably human-like. It wasn't until the medieval period that he acquired animal features, horns, and other monstrous characteristics, precisely during an era when natural human instincts were being increasingly repressed. In cultures that embraced sexuality more openly, their devil figures rarely emphasized sexual temptation. In societies that valued emotional expression, their evil entities weren't associated with stirring up feelings. The devil, it seems, always embodies whatever a culture has collectively disowned. Contemporary psychological research adds another layer to this mystery. Studies of people who report demonic encounters reveal striking correlations with their personal psychological makeup. Individuals with repressed anger often describe devils that embody rage. Those with unacknowledged sexual desires report tempters who manifest those specific desires. People raised in strict religious households with rigid rules about sinful thoughts report far more demonic oppression than those raised in traditions that encourage internal integration. These correlations suggest a projection mechanism at work rather than encounters with an objective external entity. Most tellingly, when people undergo deep psychological integration work, acknowledging and accepting previously disowned aspects of themselves, their experiences of demonic oppression typically diminish or transform entirely. This pattern holds true across cultural and religious boundaries, suggesting a universal psychological mechanism rather than a culturally specific spiritual reality. Jungian analysts working with deeply religious patients consistently observe that shadow integration work reduces perceived demonic activity more effectively than traditional spiritual warfare approaches. These anomalies point toward a revolutionary possibility. What if the devil isn't an external adversary but a projected image of our own disowned shadow material? What if the spiritual battle isn't meant to be waged against an outside enemy but requires the courageous acknowledgement and integration of rejected aspects of our own psyche? And what philosopher saw this pattern with such clarity that religious authorities found his insights too threatening to acknowledge? In the autumn of 1879, Friedrich Nietzsche found himself in a small rented room in the Swiss mountain town of Sils Maria. His health was deteriorating. Blinding migraines, devastating stomach problems, and increasingly poor eyesight had forced him to resign his university position. Isolated, physically suffering, and facing an uncertain future, Nietzsche entered what would become his most spiritually productive period. It was here, amid physical pain and existential uncertainty, that he began developing insights about the nature of evil that would challenge the very foundation of traditional religious understanding. What positioned Nietzsche uniquely to see what others couldn't was his unusual background. Trained in both classical philology and philosophical thinking, he could analyze ancient religious texts with unprecedented precision while simultaneously questioning their psychological implications. Moreover, his own experience of being labeled demonic by religious authorities for questioning cherished beliefs gave him first-hand experience of how projection works in spiritual contexts. Religious critics weren't responding to his actual ideas, but to their own fears about what questioning tradition might unleash. During daily walks through alpine meadows, when his health permitted, Nietzsche contemplated how religions create and maintain the concept of the devil. He noticed something remarkable in ancient texts that previous scholars had overlooked. The earliest religious writings contained far more nuanced and psychologically sophisticated understandings of evil than later interpretations. Over time, religious institutions had transformed what began as symbolic representations of internal psychological dynamics into literal external threats, effectively externalizing what were originally understood as aspects of human nature. In his notebooks from this period, Nietzsche wrote, "The devil is the projection of aspects of human nature that a culture has deemed unacceptable. the shadow cast by moral ideals that are too narrow to encompass the full spectrum of human experience. This wasn't just philosophical speculation, but an observation based on meticulous historical analysis. He traced how concepts of evil evolved precisely in relation to what aspects of humanity were being increasingly repressed in each historical period. As cultures developed stricter moral codes around sexuality, devils became increasingly sexualized. As expressions of anger became more regulated, demonic figures became increasingly associated with rage. What distinguished Nietzsche's analysis from mere skepticism was his recognition that these projections weren't simply mistakes, but psychologically necessary mechanisms, given the limited understanding of human nature available at the time. Lacking a framework for integrating the full spectrum of human drives and desires, people naturally projected disowned aspects outward, creating an enemy that could contain what they couldn't acknowledge within themselves. The devil thus served as a psychological repository for the rejected aspects of human nature, a necessary fiction until humanity developed more sophisticated ways of understanding and integrating the shadow. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche encoded this insight in the cryptic statement, "Of all that is written, I love only what a person has written with his blood." He was suggesting that authentic spirituality requires acknowledging even the darkest, most instinctual aspects of ourselves, our blood, rather than projecting them onto external devils. This wasn't a celebration of darkness, but a recognition that integration rather than projection is the path to genuine spiritual development. Only by acknowledging the full spectrum of our nature could we transcend the false division between godly and demonic aspects of ourselves. While walking in the mountains, watching shadows cast by the alpine sun, Nietzsche developed his revolutionary understanding. What if the devil is simply the shadow cast by our idealized self-image? What if the intensity of our spiritual battles actually reflects the energy we invest in denying aspects of our own nature? And what if true spiritual development requires not victory over an external enemy, but the courageous integration of the very parts of ourselves that we've been taught to fear and reject? Nietzsche's first compelling evidence appears in his analysis of how the concept of the devil evolved historically. In The Genealogy of Morals, he traces the transformation of ancient Hebrew Satan, originally portrayed not as an evil being, but as a challenging adversary or obstacle within God's court, into the absolute embodiment of evil in later Christian tradition. This evolution wasn't random, but corresponded precisely with increasing moral restrictions and psychological repression in the cultures where these changes occurred. As natural human instincts became more heavily regulated, the devil became increasingly monstrous, suggesting projection rather than revelation at work. Consider the striking historical pattern. Early biblical texts present Satan as essentially human in appearance and function, serving as a prosecutor or tester in divine court scenes. By the medieval period, as sexual and aggressive impulses came under stricter regulation, artistic depictions show the devil acquiring animal features, horns, tails, and monstrous appearance, visible indicators of non-human status. This transformation accelerated during periods of heightened moral restriction and slowed during more permissive eras, a correlation that makes perfect sense if the devil represents projected human impulses rather than an objective spiritual reality. The evidence extends beyond conceptual evolution to specific religious practices. Nietzsche documented how exorcism rituals across cultures follow a remarkably consistent psychological pattern. They begin by naming and identifying the demon, giving voice to precisely those emotions or desires that are taboo within the culture, then ritually expelling them. He noted that what gets confessed during exorcisms in sexually restrictive societies is predominantly sexual content, while in cultures with strict prohibitions against anger, demons primarily express rage. The specific content of demonic manifestation varies according to what each culture most strongly represses. Literary evidence provides another layer of confirmation. Analyzing works like Dante's Inferno and Milton's Paradise Lost, Nietzsche observed how the devil paradoxically becomes the most psychologically complex and human character, often expressing emotions and desires that humans naturally experience but are taught to disown. Satan emerges as the repository for disowned human qualities: curiosity, desire for freedom, questioning authority, sexual longing, and ambition. The compelling nature of these portrayals suggests they're tapping into psychological truth rather than merely depicting an external spiritual entity. Even more revealing is the evidence from mystical traditions across religions. Nietzsche collected accounts from advanced spiritual practitioners who, after years of attempting to battle the devil as an external force, experienced a profound shift in understanding. Saint Anthony in the desert, after fighting demons for years, eventually declared, "I no longer fear God or the devil. I have become as they are." Teresa of Avila wrote that what most people experience as demonic attacks are actually aspects of oneself that one has not yet learned to love. Rumi's poetry consistently frames Iblis, the Islamic devil, as a misunderstood aspect of the divine totality rather than an independent evil force. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the psychological effects of different approaches to dealing with the devil. Nietzsche observed that the more aggressively a person or culture tries to battle evil as an external force, the more powerfully it seems to manifest in their experience. Conversely, traditions that emphasize integration and understanding rather than combat report fewer negative encounters with evil. This inverse relationship makes perfect sense if we're dealing with projection rather than an objective entity. Fighting a projection only energizes it, while recognizing it as part of oneself allows for integration and transformation. All these evidence streams converge on a revolutionary conclusion. The devil isn't an external adversary, but a psychological projection of disowned aspects of human nature. This doesn't make evil less real, but locates it differently than religious traditions have typically taught. If Nietzsche is correct, then the spiritual battle isn't meant to be waged against an outside enemy, but requires the courageous acknowledgement and integration of rejected aspects of our own psyche. To understand how the devil functions as a psychological projection, we must examine what Nietzsche called the mechanics of shadow formation in individual development. This process begins early in life as children learn which aspects of their nature are acceptable and which are condemned. When certain emotions, desires, or qualities are consistently met with disapproval, the developing psyche has limited options. Either consciously experience shame for having these feelings, or unconsciously disown them by projecting them outside the self. The latter mechanism creates what we experience as the devil or evil forces, aspects of ourselves that have been exiled from conscious identification. This projection process follows predictable patterns that Nietzsche observed across diverse cultures. First comes the internal experience of a forbidden impulse or desire. Next, the ego experiences anxiety about this unacceptable content. Then, rather than acknowledging, "I am feeling wanting this," the mind transforms the experience into, "Something outside me is tempting me with this." The final step occurs when this externalized content acquires additional characteristics, becoming monstrous, powerful, or supernatural, proportional to the energy invested in the repression. The more strongly an impulse is denied, the more powerful its projected form becomes. Nietzsche documented this pattern in religious literature and personal accounts across traditions. Christian monastic texts contain numerous descriptions of monks battling sexual demons, precisely when their lifestyle required complete sexual repression. Desert fathers reported encounters with demons of gluttony during extended fasts. Medieval nuns described demonic figures tempting them with precisely the worldly pleasures their vows forbade. In each case, the specific content of demonic temptation corresponded exactly to what the individual had consciously rejected in themselves. The evidence becomes even more compelling when examining how people's perception of evil transforms through psychological development. Nietzsche collected accounts of individuals who underwent profound shifts in how they experienced the devil after psychological integration work. One particularly striking example comes from a monk who, after decades of battling demonic sexual temptation through mortification and prayer, finally acknowledged his natural sexual desires as part of his humanity rather than external demonic influence. His experience of demonic attack didn't merely decrease, it transformed entirely into an experience of accepting his full humanity as divinely created. Psychological research that emerged after Nietzsche's time has substantially confirmed his insights. Carl Jung, influenced by Nietzsche's work, developed the concept of the shadow to describe precisely the mechanism Nietzsche had identified. Modern studies on projection show that people are significantly more likely to perceive negative qualities in others when those same qualities exist unacknowledged within themselves. Brain imaging research reveals that when people judge others for qualities they deny in themselves, distinct neural patterns appear that differ from judgments about qualities they've accepted in their self-concept. What's particularly significant about this evidence is how it explains the paradoxical ineffectiveness of traditional approaches to spiritual warfare. If the devil represents projected aspects of the self, then aggressive attempts to battle this enemy actually reinforce the underlying psychological split rather than healing it. This explains why people who focus intensely on fighting the devil often report increasingly powerful demonic encounters. They're strengthening the very projection mechanism that creates their experience of an external adversary. This understanding doesn't deny the reality of negative spiritual experiences, but reconfigures their source and appropriate response. What we experience as external spiritual attack may actually be encounters with disowned aspects of ourselves, seeking reintegration into consciousness. The appropriate response, then, isn't battle, but a courageous turning toward what has been rejected, not to surrender to destructive impulses, but to acknowledge the full spectrum of human experience as part of a more comprehensive spiritual understanding. Nietzsche's analysis reveals that what makes the devil truly dangerous isn't its external power, but its nature as a fragmented aspect of ourselves, operating outside conscious awareness and control. By projecting these elements outward, we paradoxically give them more power over us than if we acknowledge them as aspects of our own nature that require conscious integration rather than unconscious projection. As we assemble the evidence, a consistent pattern emerges that Nietzsche articulated in Beyond Good and Evil, but that religious authorities have consistently resisted. What he called the Great Projection isn't limited to individual psychology, but operates at cultural, institutional, and historical levels, creating a comprehensive system that maintains the illusion of evil as exclusively external. This pattern has profound implications for how we understand both spiritual development and the nature of religious institutions themselves. The pattern begins with how religious traditions categorize human experience. Across cultures, Nietzsche observed religions dividing human qualities into godly virtues and demonic vices. This division isn't consistent across traditions. Qualities considered demonic in one culture might be neutral or even positive in another, but the pattern of division itself remains consistent. This arbitrary sorting creates the psychological conditions necessary for projection, as natural human experiences categorized as demonic must be either repressed or projected, rather than integrated into a coherent self-understanding. At the institutional level, the pattern continues with what Nietzsche called the externalization of inner conflict. Religious systems consistently transform what began as symbolic representations of psychological dynamics into literal cosmic battles. Original teachings that addressed the integration of human nature, like Jesus' emphasis on inner motivations rather than external actions, gradually evolve into elaborate demonologies and spiritual warfare manuals. This shift serves institutional purposes. External enemies create group cohesion and justify institutional authority in ways that acknowledging inner psychological complexity does not. The historical pattern reveals itself in how concepts of the devil evolve in direct response to what aspects of humanity are being increasingly regulated or repressed in each era. During periods when anger was increasingly controlled through social norms, devils became more associated with rage. As sexuality came under stricter regulation, demonic figures became more sexualized. When independent thinking threatened institutional authority, the devil became associated with intellectual curiosity. The consistent correlation between cultural repression and demonic representation provides compelling evidence for projection rather than revelation as the source of demonic imagery. Perhaps most revealing is the pattern Nietzsche identified in how spiritual maturity transforms one's relationship with evil. Across traditions, spiritual novices experience evil as an external adversary to be combated, while the spiritually mature increasingly recognize it as projected aspects of the self that require integration. Jesus' teaching to resist not evil and his instruction to love enemies rather than battle them hints at this more advanced understanding. Buddha's eventual recognition of Mara as an aspect of mind rather than an external demon reflects the same pattern. This consistent developmental trajectory suggests that the projection of evil outward is a preliminary stage of spiritual understanding rather than an ultimate truth. The pattern extends to the typical life cycle of religious movements. New spiritual insights often begin with an integration of previously rejected aspects of human experience. Jesus embracing tax collectors and sinners, Buddha acknowledging desire as part of human nature, Sufi mystics recognizing the spiritual dimensions of embodied experience. Yet as these movements institutionalize, they typically re-establish rigid boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of humanity, recreating the very conditions for projection that their founders had begun to dissolve. This cyclical pattern suggests that the projection of the devil isn't merely an error, but a recurring psychological mechanism that religious institutions often reinforce rather than transcend. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to recognize is how it's embedded in language, ritual, and cultural assumptions that shape our perception from earliest childhood. The externalization of evil feels natural and obvious, precisely because it's reinforced by every level of religious instruction and cultural narrative. Questioning whether the devil might actually be a projection of disowned aspects of ourselves challenges not just a single belief, but an entire framework through which reality has been interpreted and experienced. If the devil is primarily a projection of our disowned shadow material rather than an independent external entity, the implications for spiritual life are revolutionary. This understanding doesn't diminish the reality of negative experiences, but reconfigures how we interpret and respond to them in ways that open entirely new possibilities for spiritual transformation. What Nietzsche called the Great Reversal involves turning toward, rather than away from what we have learned to fear, not to surrender to destructive impulses, but to integrate them into a more complete spiritual understanding. First, this perspective transforms our understanding of spiritual warfare. If evil is primarily projected shadow material rather than an external enemy, then aggressive battle tactics actually strengthen the underlying psychological split rather than resolving it. Traditional approaches often intensify the very projection mechanism they're trying to overcome. A more effective response would involve what Nietzsche called the courageous facing, turning toward disowned aspects of ourselves with curiosity and compassion rather than fear and rejection. This doesn't mean acting on destructive impulses, but acknowledging them as aspects of our humanity that require conscious integration rather than unconscious projection. The theological implications are equally profound. If the devil represents projected human qualities rather than an independent being, then much religious teaching requires reinterpretation. The cosmic battle between good and evil might better be understood as the internal human struggle for psychological integration rather than a literal war between external forces. Heaven and hell could represent states of internal wholeness or fragmentation rather than external locations. Sin might be reconceived not as violations of external rules, but as actions arising from internal fragmentation and projection rather than wholeness and integration. For prayer and spiritual practice, this understanding suggests a fundamental reorientation. Rather than praying for protection against external evil forces, we might focus on the integration of disowned aspects of ourselves. Meditation practices that cultivate awareness of the full spectrum of human experience without judgment or rejection become central rather than peripheral. Confession transforms from listing external violations to acknowledging the places where we've disowned aspects of our humanity through projection. Spiritual discernment shifts from distinguishing godly from demonic influences to recognizing the difference between integrated wholeness and fragmented projection. The implications for religious communities are particularly challenging. If maintaining the devil as an external entity serves institutional purposes by creating group cohesion through shared enemies, then acknowledging the projective nature of evil requires fundamental institutional transformation. Communities would need to shift from reinforcing boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of humanity to creating spaces where the full spectrum of human experience can be acknowledged and integrated. This doesn't mean accepting destructive behavior, but recognizing that such behavior often stems from projection and fragmentation rather than conscious integration. Perhaps most profound is the implication for how we understand spiritual maturity. If the devil is a projection of disowned aspects of ourselves, then spiritual development involves not victory in eternal battle, but the progressive integration of the full spectrum of human experience into conscious awareness. The spiritually mature person isn't one who has successfully banished evil, but one who has integrated the shadow material that others continue to project as external devils. This explains why authentic spiritual masters across traditions often appear simultaneously more whole and more human, rather than otherworldly and disconnected from ordinary experience. This understanding offers a revolutionary approach to dealing with experiences traditionally attributed to demonic activity. Rather than responding with fear, rejection, and battle, we might approach these experiences with curiosity about what disowned aspects of ourselves might be seeking acknowledgement and integration. This doesn't deny the intensity or distressing nature of such experiences, but offers a path through rather than around them, a path that leads to greater wholeness rather than perpetual spiritual warfare. Why has this understanding of evil as psychological projection been so consistently suppressed or marginalized within religious traditions? Nietzsche identified what he called the conspiracy of externalization, not a conscious deception, but a multi-layered system that maintains the devil as an external entity, rather than acknowledging its projective nature. This conspiracy operates through theological frameworks, institutional structures, and cultural narratives that collectively reinforce the externalization of evil despite evidence pointing toward its psychological nature. The theological dimension of this conspiracy involves what Nietzsche called the literalization of metaphor. Religious texts often began with psychologically sophisticated metaphors that represented internal human dynamics through external narratives. Over time, these metaphors became interpreted as literal, historical, or cosmic realities. The serpent in Eden, originally a representation of internal temptation, transformed into a literal demonic being. Jesus' symbolic casting out demons became understood as battles with external entities rather than integration of fragmented aspects of the psyche. This literalization serves theological purposes. It's easier to maintain doctrinal control over literal beings than to acknowledge the complex psychological processes they originally represented. Institutionally, the externalization of evil creates powerful organizational advantages. Nietzsche documented how religious institutions benefit from maintaining the devil as an external threat rather than acknowledging its projective nature. External enemies create group cohesion, justify hierarchical authority structures, and establish the institution as necessary for protection and salvation. If evil is primarily psychological projection rather than external attack, then the role of religious institutions shifts dramatically, from protective fortress against outside threats to facilitator of internal integration. This fundamental change in purpose threatens established power structures and institutional identities. The cultural dimension of the conspiracy operates through language and narrative. Nietzsche analyzed how the very words we use to describe spiritual experience reinforce the externalization of evil. Terms like temptation, attack, and possession all presuppose external sources rather than projected internal content. Cultural narratives consistently portray heroes battling external monsters rather than integrating disowned aspects of themselves. These linguistic and narrative patterns shape perception from earliest childhood, making the projection of evil outward feel natural and obvious, rather than a psychological mechanism that could be questioned. Educational systems within religious traditions further reinforce this conspiracy. Nietzsche observed how religious education typically emphasizes rigid boundaries between good and evil, while providing minimal training in psychological self-awareness or shadow integration. Concepts like projection, unconscious motivation, and psychological fragmentation remain absent from most religious instruction, leaving adherents without the conceptual tools to recognize when they're projecting internal content outward as the devil. This educational gap isn't random. but functions to maintain the traditional understanding of evil as external rather than projected. Perhaps most insidious is what Nietzsche called the weaponization of fear. By portraying the devil as an immensely powerful external threat, religious systems create a level of fear that actively discourages questioning the nature of evil. When someone begins to consider whether demonic experiences might actually be encounters with disowned aspects of themselves, this very thought can be labeled as demonic deception, creating a closed system where the hypothesis of projection cannot even be considered without confirming the external nature of evil. This self-protecting logic effectively prevents the kind of open inquiry that might reveal the projective nature of demonic experience. The result is a comprehensive system that maintains the devil as an external entity despite evidence suggesting its psychological nature. This isn't primarily through conscious deception, but through interlocking theological, institutional, cultural, and psychological mechanisms that collectively reinforce externalization rather than integration. The conspiracy persists not because of malicious intent, but because acknowledging the projective nature of evil would require fundamental transformation at every level of religious understanding and practice, a transformation that threatens established identities, authorities, and worldviews. The most disturbing aspect of the devil as projection insight isn't just its suppression, but the systematic ways this understanding has been actively delegitimized whenever it emerges. Nietzsche's analysis of this process revealed not just disagreement with the projection hypothesis, but a pattern of specific techniques used to prevent its serious consideration. This pattern appears with remarkable consistency across different religious traditions and historical periods, suggesting not random resistance, but a predictable immune response whenever the projective nature of evil is recognized. The primary mechanism for suppressing this understanding has been mischaracterization. When mystical figures like Meister Eckhart or Jakob Böhme suggested that the devil might represent projected human qualities rather than an independent entity, their views weren't simply disputed but systematically distorted. Nietzsche documented how such perspectives were routinely misrepresented as denying the reality of evil entirely rather than relocating its source from external to internal. This created a false choice: either accept the devil as an external being or deny evil altogether, effectively excluding the nuanced position that evil is real, but primarily projected rather than objectively external. Theological authorities reinforced this suppression through selective interpretation of religious texts. Nietzsche analyzed how passages suggesting the psychological nature of evil were consistently downplayed or reinterpreted. Jesus' emphasis on inner states rather than external forces, his instruction to resist not evil, and his command to love rather than battle enemies, all hint at a more sophisticated understanding of evil as projected shadow material. Yet these teachings were systematically subordinated to passages more easily interpreted as supporting the external devil narrative. This selective emphasis created the impression that religious texts uniformly support the external devil concept, when closer analysis reveals far more nuance and psychological sophistication. Institutional mechanisms further enforced this suppression. Nietzsche observed how religious organizations developed specific responses to those who questioned the external nature of evil. Rather than engaging with the substance of such perspectives, institutions often attacked the character or spiritual authenticity of those raising such questions. Suggesting that the devil might be a projection of disowned human qualities could lead to accusations of heresy, spiritual deception, or moral corruption. This ad hominem approach effectively discouraged open inquiry into the nature of evil by making such questioning personally dangerous rather than intellectually engaging with its merits. Cultural reinforcement extended this suppression beyond formal religious contexts. Nietzsche documented how artistic depictions, popular stories, and cultural narratives consistently portrayed evil as external and demonic rather than internal and psychological. This created a pervasive background assumption that made the projection hypothesis seem counterintuitive, despite its explanatory power. When cultural representation overwhelmingly portrays devils as literal beings, rather than symbolic representations of human psychology, questioning this portrayal requires swimming against a powerful cultural current. Perhaps most troubling was what Nietzsche called the silencing of experience. He collected numerous accounts of individuals who recognized through direct spiritual experience that what they had been battling as the devil was actually projected aspects of themselves seeking integration. Yet when they attempted to share these insights, they were systematically dismissed, pathologized, or warned about spiritual deception. This created a situation where direct experience that might challenge the external devil narrative was effectively excluded from religious discourse, maintaining the illusion of consensus about evil's external nature. This multi-layered suppression has resulted in what Nietzsche termed the Great Forgetting, a collective amnesia about the psychological sophistication found in the original spiritual insights that later became codified as religious doctrines. The understanding that the devil represents projected human qualities rather than an independent entity hasn't been absent from spiritual history, but has been systematically marginalized, mischaracterized, and delegitimized whenever it appears. This pattern of active suppression suggests that the projection hypothesis threatens something fundamental about how religious systems operate and understand themselves. The final question isn't whether evil exists, but where it's located and how it operates. Nietzsche's revolutionary insight wasn't that darkness is illusory, but that we've fundamentally misunderstood its nature and appropriate response. What if the spiritual path isn't an eternal battle against an external devil, but the courageous integration of the very aspects of ourselves that we've been taught to fear and reject? What if true spiritual liberation comes not from victory over an enemy, but from the dissolution of the projection that created the enemy in the first place? This requires a fundamental shift in how we understand spiritual development. Rather than measuring growth by how successfully we've banished darkness, we might assess our development by how completely we've integrated the full spectrum of human experience into conscious awareness. This doesn't mean acting on destructive impulses, but acknowledging them as aspects of our humanity that require conscious integration rather than unconscious projection. The truly spiritual person isn't one who has eliminated the shadow, but one who has brought it into the light of awareness, where its energy can be transformed rather than projected. The practical implications are transformative. Instead of spiritual practices aimed at protection from or battle against external evil, we might cultivate approaches that facilitate shadow recognition and integration. Meditation that allows us to observe the full range of our thoughts and feelings without judgment. Contemplative prayer that opens us to the totality of our experience, rather than selectively focusing on what we deem acceptable. Psychological practices that help us identify when we're projecting internal content outward. Community rituals that acknowledge rather than deny the complexity of human nature. For those who have experienced what they interpreted as demonic attacks or spiritual warfare, this understanding offers a revolutionary approach. Rather than responding with fear, rejection, and battle, which often intensify such experiences, we might approach these encounters with curiosity about what disowned aspects of ourselves might be seeking acknowledgement. This doesn't deny the intensity or distressing nature of such experiences, but offers a path through rather than around them, a path that leads to greater wholeness rather than perpetual spiritual warfare. This perspective illuminates why Jesus' approach to evil was so radically different from conventional religious responses. His instruction to love your enemies takes on profound psychological significance if those enemies are actually projections of disowned aspects of ourselves. His emphasis on inner transformation rather than external battle reflects a sophisticated understanding of how projection creates the very evil it claims to oppose. His healing ministry focused not on fighting demons, but on restoring wholeness. Precisely what psychological integration accomplishes when we reclaim projected shadow material. The transformation extends to how we understand religious symbols and narratives. The serpent in Eden might represent not an external tempter, but the disowned instinctual nature that seeks integration into conscious awareness. Satan's fall from heaven could symbolize the psychological process of projecting disowned qualities outward rather than a literal cosmic event. Hell itself might represent not an external location of punishment, but the internal state of fragmentation that results from rejecting aspects of our humanity rather than integrating them into a coherent whole. For religious communities, this understanding offers both challenge and opportunity. The challenge involves shifting from institutions that reinforce the externalization of evil to communities that support the integration of the full spectrum of human experience. This doesn't mean accepting destructive behavior, but recognizing that such behavior often stems from projection and fragmentation rather than conscious integration. The opportunity lies in rediscovering the psychological sophistication often present in original spiritual teachings but lost in subsequent literalization and institutionalization. The most profound transformation comes in our relationship with fear itself. If the devil is primarily a projection of what we fear within ourselves, then facing those fears with courage and compassion rather than externalizing them as demonic becomes the central spiritual practice. This doesn't mean fear disappears, but that it transforms from an overwhelming force that drives projection to a natural human emotion that can be acknowledged and integrated into a more complete self-understanding. The opposite of fear isn't courage but wholeness, the integration that dissolves the very need for projection. This understanding doesn't require abandoning religion but may actually deepen religious experience by reclaiming its psychological sophistication. Many mystical traditions have long recognized that spiritual maturity involves moving beyond literal understandings to grasp the deeper psychological truths encoded in religious symbols and narratives. The devil as projection insight doesn't reject religious teaching, but penetrates to its deeper meaning, the transformative truth that has been partially obscured by literalization and externalization. The invitation is clear. Rather than continuing to battle an external enemy that paradoxically grows stronger, the more vigorously we fight it, we might turn with courage and compassion toward the disowned aspects of ourselves that we've been projecting as the devil. This isn't surrender to darkness, but the recognition that true spiritual transformation requires integration rather than endless battle. The very insight that religious authorities found too threatening to acknowledge, but that offers liberation from the cycle of projection and fear that has dominated religious approaches to evil. Will you continue fighting an external enemy that may actually be a projection of your own disowned qualities? Or will you have the courage to turn toward what you've been taught to fear, recognizing that true spiritual freedom comes not from victory over an adversary, but from the integration that dissolves the very need for enemies? The choice isn't between good and evil, but between projection that perpetuates fragmentation and integration that leads to wholeness. The real devil was never your enemy. It was your fear given form through projection. And the true spiritual path may not be endless battle, but the courageous reclaiming of all that you are.